Welcome to Late Start Advantage, where I speak with professionals who pivoted later in their careers and went on to become successful founders and business owners, proving it's never too late to start something meaningful. I'm Jacques Valencia, and today I'm joined by Peter Deans, creator of the 52 Risks Framework, founder of Gōru World, founder of Shelf Labs, founder of Notwithoutrisk Consulting, and former Chief Risk Officer at Bank of Queensland. And now, top 10 LinkedIn executives in Australia that you need to follow. And after a long career in banking and financial services, here he is. So welcome, Peter.
Hey, Jacques. Good to be here, actually. Thanks for the invitation.
Peter, congratulations on your recent top 10 executive profiles in Australia for LinkedIn. What's your secret?
Well, I'm in my 40th year of work, actually, since I started work in the late 1980s in Melbourne. To get the top 10 LinkedIn executives you should follow in Australia, I literally woke up 2 Sundays ago with hi, just to let you know you've made the top 10 list. And normally it's accompanied by a request for money for promotional activities, but it was quite genuine. I've been on LinkedIn probably 15 plus years. I always jokingly say to people, I said, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything to get on LinkedIn, and you can literally write about whatever you want to write about. Since I started was really around this sort of intersection of strategy and risk management. Being former chief risk officer of a couple of banks now, I just often see risk management and the risks get either overlooked or played down or glossed over. And so that really was what gave me the impetus to write. I guess as the years have gone on, I've got more into writing about strategy, tech, risk and compliance and reg tech, probably in the last 7 years or so, the startup world as well. So I guess I've bottled up 40 years of learnings and expertise to be an overnight success on LinkedIn.
Would you suggest to people that have a 9-to-5 to start their LinkedIn profile and build that up while they're doing their 9-to-5? Because there's a lot of things that they're learning that they can share to the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably broader advice around just passions in life more generally. But I think with LinkedIn, it's a matter of find your place a little bit. There's quite a lot of LinkedIn groups you can follow, and whatever the topic might be or whatever the industry sector. So just build your network a little bit. And again, you don't have to push out a lot of written content, even just starting to like things, comment on things that are of interest, I think is really important. There's probably a more pressing question if you're younger coming out of university, for example. Unless you're on LinkedIn, you don't exist these days. So I get quite a few people saying, I don't want to bother with LinkedIn. The risk is if you don't have much of a presence there, whether it's the recruiters or perhaps the algorithms, the AI, they sort of pose a question, well, does this person really exist? Because they don't really have a social media footprint on LinkedIn. So if you're looking for jobs and building a career, you sort of need to be in the game a little bit.
You're absolutely right. So far, all the founders that I have interviewed, one of the biggest factors of their success when they started their business is their network. And LinkedIn is a really good way to start building up your actual professional network.
Yeah, as I said, it's a really good tool. I think as a startup founder, if you don't have a lot of financial resources and don't have a marketing department, then it's obvious you really need to use what's available, of which LinkedIn's an important one. And X also a much maligned platform. You can connect and get visibility of your startup and your products globally using X if you commit a little bit of time to it.
Yeah. That's a good reminder. I should build my X for this podcast as well. Thanks for that. So now I just want to start talking about your career. So after spending 30 years at the highest level in banking, was there a moment early on that shaped how you see risk today?
There's actually no one particular event. Some people talk about a light bulb moment with either career changes or major life changes. I started in Melbourne in 1987. I did commerce at Melbourne University. I joined a bank, which doesn't actually exist now. It was sold to ANZ in 1990. And what sort of shaped me, I guess, as a business executive and certainly a risk manager as I ended up, there was a lot of major external shocks that were unexpected. The end of the first year, October 1987, was the Black Friday Wall Street crash, the worst stock market correction since the Great Depression. 3 years later, 1990, we had what was coined the recession we had to have by the then Treasurer, Paul Keating. Interest rates go from, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was about 4 or 5% up to 19%. And if that was
crazy.
Mortgages. And then if you were a business borrower, businesses were paying 21, 22%. And There was a lot of problems. Unemployment went to double digits. A couple of the major banks almost failed, and virtually all of the state government-owned banks all failed as well. And so that, in terms of shaping the way I think about risk, was, the first sort of 4 years of my banking career was a bit of a baptism of fire, and seeing hundreds of businesses go broke, people lose their jobs. And then it just kept happening with a little bit of regular monotony. The Asian financial crisis was next. Then we rolled into the global financial crisis as well, with September 11 sort of in the middle of that as well. I was in the US when it happened. It was like, here we go again, another crisis. And then along came COVID in 2020. In my commerce degree, I studied economics and economic history. My perspectives were very much grounded in the impact that events can have on economies and how economies work, the positives and negatives. And fast forward to 2026, we've got war in the Middle East. I think there's a lot of business executives, actually politicians now, they're a little bit battle hardened by having regular crises thrust upon their organisations. And I think actually that goes to business resilience as a concept, which maybe we can talk about that if we get some time. When I first started, risk management was not really thought of. There was credit risk in a bank, there was market risk and liquidity risk. If you moved outside financial services, or even just outside banking, actually, businesses really just talked about cash flow, profits, and the whole concept of risk management was almost foreign, actually. And that sort of evolved into, I guess, risk and compliance became a little bit more of a common term through the 1990s and the 00s. It's become quite a rich and complex subject around risk management, business resilience. And in the financial services sector, we sort of talk about financial risks and non-financial risks as, cybersecurity risk, compliance risk. These years we talk about AI risk now, and there's a whole range of AI sort of related risks, which again, are different and need to be thought of differently and managed differently. So the external environment has shaped my thinkings and perspectives a lot. We used to talk about business cycles, and it's less so much about business cycles now. It's more around dealing with uncertainty and living with a whole range of potential shocks and uncertainty and building resilient businesses and economies. That was also quite a lot of my thinking around the creation of the 52 Risks Management Framework, which had its genesis over 15 years ago now.
Is there anything that the everyday person can do to prepare for the types of risks that you're talking about, the economic fallout, big crises like COVID, stuff that you wouldn't think that would happen, but did happen? Is there anything that the everyday person can prepare for that?
Yeah, I guess it's the definition of everyday person a little bit. I mean, for the man or woman in the street who's not in a business role, it's quite challenging because it comes down to personal financial resilience. One of the good lessons from COVID was you sort of need to have financial reserves effectively. And the decisions made by the politicians and policymakers to, provide financial support during COVID was helpful. But I think the ones living from paycheck to paycheck were sort of caught out a little bit. I'd like to think that there's been some learnings from that. And interestingly, again, if you talk to the younger generation, there's been a real reluctance to take on debt and credit cards. Some of my sort of younger relatives that are coming out of high school and university really view debt as a bad thing and loath to have credit cards. And interestingly, I think that sort of gave rise to the Afterpay business. The buy now, pay later business was a more palatable form of very short-term credit that imposed a discipline on them, in theory, to pay off whatever they bought fairly quickly. So I think for the everyday person, I think it's really around financial resilience. I think there's certainly the way AI is disrupting the employment market, and I'm not an expert on where this all ends up, but if there are less jobs, there's a real issue for individuals and society where the potential for businesses to be disrupted, I think the impact is very real for employees and managers. And so in the 52 risks framework, one of the strategic risks that I've documented is what I call business model risk. Sounds a little bit of an academic term, but it is one that just says, well, what's the risk of your business being disrupted by something? The classic example I point to is the taxi industry and Uber. Literally overnight, the economics of the taxi industry, the incomes that taxi drivers and the taxi plate owners didn't quite evaporate, but it went on a pretty quick downhill slide, and they were opened up to competition that they really never saw coming. So I think everyone in organisations, whether you're a smaller business or a larger business, certainly if you're in a leadership role, you need to be alert to this business disruption risk. And I think in an AI world where you can create software apps and platforms literally in the time we do this podcast, and you probably have the business launch tomorrow morning, I think businesses need to constantly stay abreast of society changes, technology changes. And again, talking about buy now, pay later is another really good example of business model risk, because large financial institutions, banks all around the world, and the payments companies made billions and billions of dollars off the whole merchant credit card business. And then that was disrupted again, not quite overnight, but within a matter of years. Afterpay went from being something no one had heard of to a massive global business that ultimately got sold for large dollars to Square and Block.
What's a risk you underestimated early in your career, and what happened because of it?
My roles changed so much over the years. I was sort of like a commercial lending manager, effectively, lending money to businesses, small, medium and large. So we were obviously thinking a lot around financial risks. If I go back 20 or 30 years ago, cybersecurity risk didn't exist. When I started, we didn't have email. We just had memorandums in triplicate with carbon paper. Fortunately, that was only really the first year. But then we got emails. Lotus 123 was about year 3. And I think Excel was maybe a year after that, and everyone got off Lotus 123 onto Excel. So, and mobile phones didn't exist either back then. Technology risks have obviously played a big issue in the last 10 years. I wouldn't say I underestimated them, but the threat has changed dramatically. I think also what's been surprising, I guess, is the way that technology supply chains have actually developed so quickly. I think that's caught a lot of larger organisations out. And this was also the impetus behind some of the financial regulators saying we really need to understand third and fourth party risk exposures, because a lot of financial institutions, they fundamentally don't understand who is sitting behind their outsourcing contracts and the technologies and apps they're using. I think that's probably a risk for small to medium-sized businesses, that they just don't fundamentally know, the risks of some of their major service providers. And if you're a small to medium-sized business, you don't have an IT department, you have a third party that provides your IT services. So I think often it's just a little bit of a wing and a prayer that they're well credentialed, they haven't done a bad job, or they came referred from someone. So I think IT and supply chain risks is probably the big ones. I think geopolitical has sort of always been there, but again, in this much more hyper-connected world where supply chains, they don't just exist across regions. Supply chains are doing laps of the planet now, where semiconductor chips are so relied upon a number of rare earths, petrochemical-related products that are coming out of the Middle East. And I think if you ask the layman, it's like, all the semiconductors are made in Taiwan, so as long as there's not a problem in Taiwan, we're okay. But unfortunately, whether it's cars or phones, components are coming from all around the world. So in terms of understanding the risk profile of a business, if you're running it, or if you're an equity investor, a debt investor, or a lender, it's particularly challenging. I always used to somewhat flippantly say, and I still do, is look, diversification won't cure all ills, but it'll go a long way to making sure you're resilient. And I think larger companies, they'll look for multiple sources for many things. So if one falls away for geopolitical or other reasons, they've got another one. Apple's quite famous for many years. Everything was manufactured in China. They've now diversified so that they're not as reliant upon China. Diversification can't cure all ills, but it's a very good strategy.
It's probably a stupid question for you, but I just want to ask, what happens to people's money if a bank shuts down?
It's a very good question. In Australia, there's a legislative framework, which means that deposits are guaranteed by the industry insurance scheme, effectively up to $250,000. So if one institution defaults, your deposits are guaranteed up to that amount. The regulatory frameworks are very good. And one of their main objectives from a policy perspective is make sure that claim system never gets utilised. So if a bank gets into financial difficulties, they will either close the business or they'll be sold to someone else, and the depositors are kept whole, essentially, so they don't lose money. So that's the main protection. It's called the Financial Claims Scheme.
Hello. Thank you very much for watching so far. Please subscribe to this channel. That's the best way to support me at the moment. And please like this video if you're enjoying the conversations thus far. Now let's continue the episode. When you were in banking, what's something that you saw inside large banks that would surprise people on the outside?
I still have a lot of friends that work in banks, so I need to be careful not to be too critical. Look, I think there's a few things of interest here, whether they're surprises or not. Ultimately, banks are very large organisations, 30, 40, 50,000 employees for the Australian ones. And if you go to the US, the big ones, they've got hundreds of thousands of employees. It's a double-edged sword. They have access to really good resources. They can produce really good products and services, and certainly today, a really good chance at producing fantastic apps and software platforms. The flip side is that just as large numbers of people are somewhat bureaucratic, I think they're sort of always having to defend their turf a little bit. So again, I'm not sure if that's a surprise, but yeah, the decision-making can be slow at times. Just a couple of things. This goes back to, let's think about your risk questions earlier on. Large banks and financial institutions have to absorb a lot of fraud, external fraud, and at times internal fraud as well, because there's just so much money floating around the system within banks that they are a little bit of a honeypot that attracts, bad actors. There's a lot of complaints around high credit card interest rates. The reality is that in part they're high because there's just such a large incidence of credit card fraud. And as people might know, if an airline goes broke or if a retailer goes broke and they haven't given you the service you paid for, the banks, effectively through the payment system, they compensate the consumer. So the consumer's not left out of pocket because they bought something on a credit card and then the product or service wasn't delivered. So I think one of the things that might surprise people is the level of losses that the banks absorb, certainly in credit card and the broader fraud category. It's just the cyber fraud, ransomware, phishing, hacking, individuals having their credentials stolen in click this link type attacks. And banks, they're spending billions of dollars to try and prevent this, both for their own benefit, but also to protect the customers and consumers. I think we're probably surprised at the resources that banks are devoting to fighting effectively financial crime.
It's good to know that they're spending that money to at least protect the people as much as possible so that they can keep the money that they are earning. After such a long corporate career, what made you step away and start your own path?
Yeah, look, I think there was, as I said earlier, there was no real light bulb moment. I think the last executive role was 7 years, and I'd always been conscious of two things. One, I didn't want to get stale. I didn't want to make bad decisions, and I always had really good teams working underneath me as well, and I didn't want to hold back any of the teams from a succession planning perspective. And I do sort of fervently believe that in any one role, you do have a use-by date. I don't know whether it's 4 years, 5 years or 10 years. I think if you get closer to 10, you're probably getting a bit closer to use-by date. For organisations, if there is a successor for someone who's going to go 10 years, there's always a chance they'll just go somewhere else because they don't want to wait the whole time. So I was always conscious that I didn't want to stay too long. As I got closer, certainly as I clocked up 30 years in banking and finance, I felt I wanted to go and do some other things. That was probably more of the reason. Was I had so many ideas and things I wanted to do, and you certainly don't have the bandwidth from a time perspective. I mean, a C-suite executive job at a bank is more than a full-time occupation from a time perspective. And you just don't also have the spare mental capacity because you're so focused on the job itself. And the world is a very complex place. Banks are very complex institutions. So it's just difficult to sort of say, I'd like to do the job 4 days a week and then do something else on the side one. It's just not really possible. And you wouldn't do the job justice. So I think I got to 30, it was 32 years in the end. It was like I just got other things I wanted to do. And the 52 risk framework had always been a little bit of a side passion project, which got me into the writing. We talked about the LinkedIn sort of accolade earlier. I wanted to just share my experiences in a structured manner with the 52 risk framework, which is a free framework. I don't charge for it. I did a risk management course at Harvard University in 2010, which was a pilot course. It was a great experience going to Harvard, going to Cambridge, being on campus, met all these amazing executives from all around the world. But interestingly, the course content was not that well developed because Harvard was really grappling with the same thing I've talked about already. It's like, well, how do we think about risk management? It doesn't really have a structure to it. There's been research, but it hasn't really tossed up any sort of leading industry approach or framework. And I said to Bob Kaplan, who was the faculty sponsor, who's a lovely guy, he was the author of the Balanced Scorecard, which I'm sure some of your listeners will know. Him and David Norton created in the 1980s this way of measuring financial and non-financial progress of organisations against their strategy. And so it was fantastic to meet Bob. I spent quite a bit of time with him, but I still remember him saying, I think it was day 3, he said, how do you think we're going? And I literally said, great to be in Harvard for the week, great to meet these amazing people, so much history. I said, the subject matter is still a lot of work to be done in the risk space. And he agreed. He did say, he said, it is a pilot course. And I said, you should probably give everyone a discount for the fact it's a pilot course. But even since, I don't think they've run the course too many times since then. And there still isn't a lot of universities that invest a lot in risk management, unfortunately. That's a little bit of a gap that I saw where I thought if I'm not working full-time, I can spend a bit more time writing about that. I do talks on risk management every couple of weeks. I just couldn't do that while I was doing executive career. And with Not Without Risk, which is the consulting business that sort of came out, a bit of a COVID baby in mid-2020 with 2 former colleagues, singing the praises of having good risk management frameworks in place and trying to make businesses understand risks better. So that was also part of my purpose. Was I did want to continue to talk about risk without possibly being tied to the desks. And then probably coming to more of the startup side of things now, I just didn't have the bandwidth to spend time learning about new technologies, talking to founders, really sort of embracing this extraordinary period of innovation we're in. And it's been 7 years since I retired from executive life. It's been fantastic to spend the time, go around talking to founders, travel mostly in Asia, but occasionally used to be Europe and the US. Just tell me more about what you're doing, what new technologies are there. And I knew that I would just have more time to sort of learn about these new businesses, new technologies, whereas if I was tied to the desk, stuck in an office, the world would have just passed me by and I'd probably get a little bit too old to appreciate the good things that are out there.
You mentioned something about a use-by date. Can you please explain this? As you know, there's a lot of people in a company for so long, maybe decades. It's just something that I haven't heard of from anyone before.
Yeah, well, it's probably, I think if you look at people, let's say less than 20 years in the workforce, I wouldn't use the term use-by date. I'd just be more thinking of, and this was always something I tried to do, is like stay in a role 2-3 years. After that, unless the role is changing and you're having new challenges, you sort of really need to do something else. Either get the organisation to give you more responsibility, think about what else can you do while staying in the role to sort of develop professionally and personally. Ideally, if you move into another role, even if it's a sideways or lateral role, you'll learn more things just with different activities, different people you're working with, different clients, different processes or whatever it might be. So I was always like, you really need to be progressing, particularly out of university through to mid to late 30s. You need to be moving every 2-3 years at most from a development perspective. If people are not too fussed about career, professional development, or quite happy just doing a job, that's fine. You can do that. I'd probably say you just get a bit stale in the job and possibly less effective as the years go on. When you get into sort of senior management and the executive ranks, I think the use-by-date concept, which is it's a little bit of a tough term actually, but the use-by-date concept is if you're in exactly the same role for 6, 7, 8, 10 years, there's always a risk that people stop listening to you. They've heard the same thing over and over again. You may get into a bit of a rut yourself and complacency that you keep thinking the same way. If you've had a good time where nothing's going wrong, the complacency may creep in. And the one which was always a bit of an issue in financial services is hubris, which is where we're doing so well, nothing's gone wrong, we're the greatest team on the planet. Hubris, likewise, it sort of manifests itself in complacency where things get overlooked and the organisation itself becomes a bit stale because of that. So the use by date, again, it's a bit of a harsh term, but even if you look at executive teams, and there's a lot of university studies on this, is that an injection of new talent and refreshing of the executive teams does actually make organisations strategically and financially more resilient because you just have these different perspectives coming in. And if you have got complacency or staleness and a team has just missed something, you may have a better chance of getting that. In the sort of ASX world, the listed company world, there's quite a lot of guidance on this that maximum terms for directors should be, I think, 9 years, three terms of 3 years. And it's for exactly that reason. And then you probably have the more, also nefarious sort of suspicions of, well, if people stay longer, it's perhaps to cover up stuff that they haven't been doing. I probably don't subscribe to that generally, but there is also an element of if you get new management teams, new executives in, they can have a fresh look at something and they may uncover some sort of risk or compliance issue that wasn't identified.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. What was the hardest part of going from a senior executive role to starting again?
Oh, I don't think there was nothing hard about it.
It was actually easier for you now because now you have capacity.
No, it was more, I think, look, my makeup is, I guess I don't need the validation or reassurance. And I'm sure your listeners will have heard of the relevance deprivation syndrome, which is you go from being an important person to a nobody. I actually felt that was really good. It was like I'd gone from having 12 or 13 meetings a day, having limited control over where I was and what I was doing week in, week out. I did have some control, but ultimately there was a board schedule. I had 2-3 days of board and committee meetings every month. I knew the dates they were on, and there was certainly an expectation I was always there. And then we had other fixed events in the year, regulatory reviews and meetings, shareholder meetings, half-year results, full-year results. So the calendar was always locked in. So I think stepping off that treadmill was actually personally fantastic just because I just all of a sudden had this freedom that I didn't have before. But it's not that, it was always part of the deal. I knew I had to do it, and, you get all the perks and rewards that go with those roles as a result. But I think having full flexibility and control over what I did, where I was, who I worked with, that was fantastic. I touched on it before. I think just having the mental capacity to start to think about, well, what else do I want to do now, and where do I want to spend my time? And again, it's a part of, I don't want to say selfishly, but what's the stuff I really enjoy doing that is personally rewarding? So that's important. But also, where can I make the impact as well? And so making an impact was always a big part of it. And I think with 52 risks, and we haven't chatted about the Gōru Startup Toolkit project, but they're very much impact initiatives in a sense that I really do want to make a difference with those. So I think that was sort of what was driving me. Interestingly also, and this happens, up until today, I get a lot of people that I'd worked with, and not so much as word got out, but just as I spend a bit more time, whether it's with university startup incubators or whether it's venture capital firms or just businesses generally, once people understood a little bit about who I was and what I'd done, and certainly, as your podcast is sort of talking about people that get out of corporate life to start something up, I'd actually get quite a lot of people coming to me to say, do you mind if we just have a chat? I said, sure. And I would always say yes to someone, whether it was a Zoom call or if they wanted to have a face-to-face meeting. And a lot of them were like, I've got this idea. What do you think? Or quite often I left my job, and a lot of slightly older people, and I'm sure your your other podcast guests will talk to this. A lot of people get restructured, made redundant, their roles get made redundant later in career. And so quite a few of them were just a little bit lost and just wanted someone to talk to. So I'm like,
the relevance deprivation syndrome.
Well, I think some of them, you're just not even having a routine. With some of the banking sort of people, that just work for one institution their whole time, and then that job's come to an end, and safety net's been removed on many, many levels. And so I think some would come and see me and say, look, I don't know what to do. What do you think I should do? And so it's a little bit of, I guess a bit of informal counselling. So I'd just come up with some ideas, and it was always like, just get out and talk to people. Doing exactly what you do is really important, because I think, and I'm probably not too close to this now, but certainly in decades gone past, if you're a senior executive that was made redundant or restructured, they'd give you a support package through one of the firms that specialise in redundancies and outplacements, is the term. I think that's gone away a little bit. It's an expensive model. I think it's sort of been dumbed down a little bit. It's perhaps here's a link to some online learning modules about how to think about another career. And I think also going back maybe 10, 15 years ago, a lot of older executives and middle management, they go and start up a business. And, of course, starting up a business like a traditional SME, whether it's a coffee shop or a news agent, I mean, they are risky businesses in themselves. So I think there's a bit of wariness from, older people on, well, what do we do? And so, again, I've always been very conscious, take the time to, help people talk through whatever it might be. And it's a matter of thinking about what skills they've got, what they're good at doing and what they enjoy doing. Obviously, if there's, financial pressures, then maybe you just need to work pretty hard at finding another job rather than trying to start up your own venture or have a dramatic career change. So I think that's been a big part of changing my sort of work routine, and then obviously being a little bit more experimental with some of the newer ventures. And again, Shelf Labs is the most recent one, which is a pure tech startup. And myself and my co-founders, we've put cold hard cash in, and we spend a lot of our own time getting the business built and the tech built. It's actually fun. I'm really enjoying it. I could never have done it in the executive life, and that was always the deal.
What you just told me suddenly made me remember about ikigai, which is what you're good at, what you love doing, what makes money, and the best thing that I've heard of recently is what's good for the world. And that overlap is a really good answer usually.
Gōru World's written a blog on ikigai as well, so we have touched on that. But I think it's important to, and I think this is also quite interesting. If I go back to when I first started, came out of university, the whole concept of social purpose and even corporate social responsibility almost didn't exist. ESG definitely didn't exist. But I've noticed over the years, and I'd spend quite a bit of time going through the graduate recruitment process each year, understanding what types of graduates we were looking to recruit. Whilst I wouldn't impose myself in the recruitment process, I'd make sure that I'd have some engagement. And again, it was more, I wanted the line managers down in my hierarchy, like, you're the ones that have to work with these kids and graduates. You need to be really comfortable you're hiring the right ones. I may have a view about them, but what I think is not important. But I would spend time with them just trying to understand the types of graduates that were wanting to work with us, what their DNA was, what their makeup was, what was important to them as well. And what I'd sort of learned, and it wasn't news to me, as I'd always felt this was the case, but certainly the younger generation was much more purpose-driven as a general statement than previous generations. No doubt about it. I mean, it almost a sea change, actually. Almost a sea change. And I think today, again, we've touched on just disruption and AI earlier on. I think it's creating some real challenges both for employers as well as for graduates, that it's a very different world, and trying to have that alignment, as you said, between work that you're good at when a whole lot of different types of work doesn't exist or may not exist, work that you pays well may not exist, and then the purpose and impact, I think, is a bit challenging. And what's also quite interesting, spent a fair bit of time in the last 12 months in Japan, I think sort of 4 trips, and heading up there the week after next. the startup scene there has got literally hundreds and thousands of really, really enthusiastic, keen young Japanese kids, guys and girls under 25, who are far more driven than what I've seen in many other countries to start their own business. And I think it's been a bit of the disillusionment with the other path, which is, and I've generalised, the corporate salaryman path, or it might actually be about the casualisation of the workforce, essentially like, well, you can either do the corporate stuff if there's a job, you can do the low-paid hospitality job, which it's not a career, it's just an activity, or you can do something like do your own startup. And so there's a lot of passion there in Japan in the younger generation, and a lot of them it's purpose. They're wanting to build businesses that they are passionate about, that have a real purpose. I do see it here a little bit, but I think we're a smaller population at 28 million. Perhaps we have the embarrassment of riches that Australia is still fundamentally a wealthy country. Perhaps there isn't the hunger or desire that you see on scale with some of these larger countries. China's another good example. China, Indonesia, you really have to work pretty hard to have a good life there because there just isn't the opportunities you might see in Australia.
As a C-suite executive, what advice do you have regarding managing senior leaders?
The first principle is a little bit of you need to think that your role is to help them as much as possible deliver on the mission for them and their team. So what do I need to do to make you and your team successful? That to me has got to be the starting position. I've had a lot of bad bosses over the years. I've had some really good ones as well. The micromanagers who were more aligned with them getting comfortable, they knew what was going on, or in the worst case, making sure they looked good was the sole objective. It just didn't work. And so as I went further up the ranks, I was more like, I'm not going to be like those difficult bosses I had. And, I had advice and coaching, had some really good mentors along the way. And I think that the best approach always was, how do I make my team and my individual managers and their teams successful? And I would sort of have a formal monthly one-on-one with all of my direct reports. In reality, I'd be talking to them every day, informal meetings, but we'd always make sure we had a monthly check-in, and it was almost like, okay, what issues have you got? What do you need me to help you with? That was, I think, always the best approach. Now, if things didn't go right or we had problems, whether it's team problems or management problems, it's like, okay, we'll tackle that as part of the overall approach and discussion, but it wasn't always agenda item number one, the problems I have with you. It was more just, okay, well, where are we up to? And it was also setting goals. It was also being very clear that everyone's aligned on what our goals as a larger team are, and making sure that everyone was all working towards those bigger goals, because I think that's also the thing to prevent is this misalignment. And it goes to that staleness point we talked about before. I used to work in some teams where we never really knew what the goal was each year, or if we were given a financial goal or some KPIs, they were sort of handed down as like, oh, they're the same as last year. We know they're unachievable. We're going to have the same argument each year. So it was like, the organisation never really had a chance, because from day one of the financial year, large slabs of the organisation felt the financial goals were unachievable. So I think I was always careful to make sure, and this is part of a leader's role, is you do have to defend your group a little bit to say, look, what you want us to do is not going to be achieved. We'll go away and work out how can we achieve it, and how can we actually help the organisation achieve its goals. And we always, and again, for those listeners who've spent a long time in the corporate world, the worst times would always be, we've got to cut the costs 5%, or we cut headcount 5%. And that was one of the most destructive periods. And it wasn't just once, it's happened repeatedly. It was like, you have to cut headcount 5%. Not even the financial number. It's just like, if you've got 100 people, 5 need to go. And it was always such a blunt instrument. And I often used to say, well, if you were thinking of doing that, why didn't you tell us 2-3 months ago? And we could have reshaped the workforce. We could have paused recruitment. If we've got, say, 2 roles there which are vacant, or someone's moving to another role. Or maybe both roles can go and I can hire 3 graduates or restructure the workforce and you'll get the financial savings. I used to stir things up a little bit. It's like, I'll get you the financial savings, but I need 1 additional headcount. And of course, the finance people would go a bit crazy because I'd say, well, if I've got 2 very expensive roles, I can move and replace with 3 junior roles. We have +1, but we've saved money. And they're like, oh, we can't do that because we've been told it's a headcount reduction. It still happens in organisations, unfortunately, the larger ones. So some of them are a bit dysfunctional. So I was always, as I said, I think it's a role as a leader is to defend your turf a little bit, but constructively think about, well, how can I deliver what the organisation wants and still maybe even have better outcomes? And technology, again, is really good at helping that these days. So the ability to be more efficient and improve processes with sensible investment in technology is definitely the way forward.
How do you manage high achievers? And on the flip side, what about the problem makers?
I think the high achievers generally look after themselves. I think the challenging high achievers were the ones who may be a little bit lower on the EQ and management and leadership skills side. So very driven for the business outcomes, but it may be a little bit at the expense of some of their colleagues or some of their employees. So high achievers themselves were fantastic and love to have more high achievers, but it was always just watching out for the ones where it may have come at the expense of something else. Again, this is a little bit of the coaching role as a manager. If I had a high achiever who was working 7 days a week and not seeing his kids or picking them up from school, or his marriage was suffering, I'm like, maybe you need to take some time off. It's like, just ease back a little bit. So it's a bit of checking on those very high achievers. Underperformers is also an interesting definition because fundamentally 90% are doing their jobs. You may not have high achievers in that 90%, so you won't have all of them as high achievers. You'll have the middle who are they're just doing a good job and they don't aspire to be CEO.
The bell curve.
Yeah, it's a bit the bell curve. I think you certainly, with the poorer performers, and I was always counselling my leaders, said you need to be fairly quick and decisive in getting to the bottom of what the issue is. And if there is the ability to turning it around, because to have these things go for multiple periods, be it 6 months, years, it's a problem for the organisation. It's actually, and I was always quite big on the equity and fairness. I said, well, if someone's not pulling their weight, it's unfair on the rest of the team. And even though in financial services the bonus regime was fairly strong and healthy, you could disproportionately reward the high performers, the middle performers, and the underperformers would get nothing. But again, that in itself was a bit of a blunt instrument because the person was still there earning a salary, and whatever the reason was for the underperformance, whether it was being a troublemaker or just not performing, that would impact the team. So I was always like, you've got to be fair on people and equitable all round, but ultimately if they're not delivering and not pulling their weight, the solution needs to be come up with fairly quickly. It's a bit brutal perhaps, but of course deal with it fairly. We'd always like, okay, well maybe it's a square peg in a round hole. So can we get to the bottom? Is the person got skills? Good person's just they're in a round hole, square peg in a round hole. Or quite often people get it a little bit over promoted. So sometimes it was like, well, maybe they shouldn't be running a team of 20 people. Maybe let's see if it's a management issue. Let's move them into another role where they might have a smaller team or even no team members. So horses for courses a little bit.
You created the 52 risk framework. What problem were you trying to solve?
Genesis of 52 risks, I think I mentioned sort of been through quite a few external shocks, and the global financial crisis was actually quite a seminal one because in Australia there was a lot of large corporates that went out of business, and then overseas you had the really big organisations like Lehman Brothers, RBS, HBOS, AIG, the insurance group, and a lot of the Australian ones all had very public profiles, and a number of them were financially over-leveraged. At a professional level, I didn't think the strategies made sense. They basically weren't well-managed businesses. They took excessive risks and didn't understand the risks. And so that had always got me thinking about, well, is there a management framework that can help, whether it's managers, like executives, board members of a particular company, better articulate, understand risks and manage them. Or if you're an external party such as a banker, a lender, or an equity investor looking in, is there a better way that you can think about risk in a business? There was nothing there. And that's what took me to the course in Harvard. I thought I'll go to the peak learning body in the world for executive education. And I came away, well, they haven't really got this problem nailed. And so I sort of started writing down the risks, literally just a list of risks. I think I had 48 for the first couple of years, and then added a couple, split a couple up, and I did get to 52. And I thought it just needs a bit of a plain English explanation for not so much the everyday man in the street, but the every business person in the street, to be able to understand what are strategic risks, what are financial risks, and what are operational risks. And that was pretty well the genesis of it. I just wanted a uniform taxonomy where organisations weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper, or they weren't having a bias. And this was also always something that worried me, was there was always a bias towards either strategic risks or operational risks, or if you had a very good CFO, financial risks, but often it was to the exclusion of others. I think even today, if you actually asked risk professionals, can you give us the top 10 list of operational risks, you'll end up with a different list. If you go to a doctor, if you've broken a finger, like the bone at the top of your finger, every doctor calls it the same thing. Like there is a common name for that bone at the top of the finger, whereas unfortunately the risk profession has different names for different parts of the finger. So I was really wanting to make a bit of a contribution to the management thinking. It's all free. It's an infographic you can print out. I've had feedback from here all around the world that management teams print it out, boards print it out. They tick it off. And I said, I'm very happy if people just want to use it as a checklist. It's better than nothing. So that was the genesis of it.
And also for the viewers and the listeners, I will put all of the link in the description. Hi, you can support this channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you very much. Why do most leaders struggle to identify risks before they become real problems?
If you go from country to country, you've got different cultural management practices driven by culture. I think Australia, possibly the US as well, leans to more optimistic outcomes, wanting to think of positive outcomes and not wanting to have to stare into the downside. I think some cultures, the management thinking is more, let's work on the downside or the worst case. So I think there's an element of not wanting to think about risks. This is always a bit of a pushback with certainly the chief risk officers over the years in financial services, is like, well, they would say that they're the negative people in the room. Or if you know Edward de Bono's black hats, is meant to be the challenge hat, but it's sort of perceived as being negative. So I think there's a view that talking about risks is talking about negative outcomes, and we don't want to talk about negative outcomes. And unfortunately, risk management's not that sexy. So, the money, unfortunately, just doesn't seem to come to the risk management community. I'm normally an optimist, but I think in that area, that is a bit of a gap. It's unfortunate.
You now work closely with startups. What's the biggest difference between how founders think about risk versus corporates?
Being a startup and being a startup founder is a fundamentally risk-taking activity. Key contract risk is one of the strategic risks. A startup wants to get one contract to earn some revenue, have a foundational client. The moment you have that contract, you have key contract risk, because if you lose it or go away, you lose the revenue. That's the same as any organisation, but the startup construct is you start with zero and you get one, and we're happy to have one because we're willing to take that risk. And the investors take the risk as well, that if you only have one or two or three, or you may take a while to get there, that's fine. That's the risk profile that we're happy with. Lots of the other risks in the early days are just accepted. Key person risk. Every early stage startup has key person risk. A bit of the work I do as an advisor with some of the startups is like, okay, well, what's the point at which, when you have got some momentum, got some revenue clients, when do you start to build out the team so you have actually got contingency planning? And not that someone would necessarily leave, but just health issues or personal reasons. Someone might want financial reasons, might need to go back to a corporate job. So I think definitely a high risk profile, and that's the name of the game. And then some of the non-financial risks, which we talked about, like cybersecurity, data privacy, compliance. Startups need to be pretty well on their game day one with that because you're not going to get a contract. And if you have a cyber event or lose customers' data or get hacked, well, your startup is out of business straight away. So the risks are no different in some respects. The consequences of some of those risks are a little bit more fatal than a larger organisation. But I think, as we've talked about with this podcast, there are some mid to late stage founders, and I think there's a few studies around saying that there's quite a lot of them and they're being successful. I always say just identify the risks, talk about it. That's the best way to get started. Not talking about it is a big problem.
You've worked with hundreds of businesses. What separates the ones that succeed from the ones that don't?
I've thought about this a lot over the years. The most successful businesses, and interestingly, the most successful risk managers, are literally the self-made millionaires and billionaires because they have it all up here. They have no desire to have a fatal risk event. As a business owner, you actually don't want to run out of money and go out of business. So the really successful ones understand their businesses intimately, they understand the risks intimately, and they certainly manage them so that they don't go out of business. Whereas in the corporate world, it tends to be a lot more conflicting objectives. Often it's a bit of the finger pointing of like, oh, I thought you were looking after that risk, or higher up would say, I thought those people in that group were looking after it, or even the middle people say, oh, I thought the executive team was looking after that risk. So whereas if you're owning your own business, certainly the very big, successful, privately owned ones, that those entrepreneurs and founders, they understand their risks inside out and understand their businesses inside out. So I think that's always one of the big takeaways, particularly startups and small to medium-sized businesses. You need to be constantly talking about these risks. Make sure you understand the nature of them, and maybe this is a bit of my corporate thinking, but have clarity on roles and responsibilities. Like even if you're small, it's like, who's actually responsible for this risk? Who's the person dealing with the government on compliance, or who's the person dealing with the suppliers around whether it's food safety or whether it's continuity of supply, making it very clear roles and responsibilities. And if you've got like a dozen employees, that's as important as if you've got 200 employees.
And for you personally now, what matters to you now that didn't matter earlier in your career?
Yes, that's a really good question. Just thinking about age. What's important now is really just making an impact, working on projects that I really enjoy working on. I do get a bit of a kick out of seeing founders do well. But I must say, like some of the younger ones, these kids 19, 20 years old, like they're just like years ahead of where I was at that age. Certainly from a technology perspective, a lot of desire to get ahead and do some really good stuff. And I was always, don't take yourself too seriously. Make sure you enjoy the work you're doing, have a bit of time to do some fun stuff, just take some time out, celebrate success, and even celebrate failure sometimes. Maybe we should talk about this. Failure was a dirty word in the corporate world and financial services. You were never even contemplated failing, whereas in the startup world, failure is accepted, fail fast preferably, but okay, if something doesn't quite work out, that's fine, we move on to something else, or we pivot to something else, or we take bits of this business. That's a very, very different philosophical approach to the corporate world. That was probably one took me a little bit of a time to get my mind around. Originally was like even just the concept of failing, let alone fail fast, was a very problematic concept to me. And I think when it comes to celebrating success, even if a project or initiative or a venture hasn't been as big a success, that's no reason you shouldn't celebrate the good work that's been done, the commitment, and whatever little success you have. And of course, the startup world, they love celebrating even little successes just to keep the team all fired up. And if you're in a venture where people aren't being paid salaries, it's important to certainly celebrate every activity until you can afford to pay them.
And you did mention about failure. What's the best example that you've seen of a business, either a startup or corporate, or maybe one of both, where they managed failure really gracefully and they actually benefited from the failure?
I won't answer the question directly around a specific example, but I think I'll probably just talk more to where there has been success. It's acknowledging this is not working or not going to work. How do we change quickly rather than persisting with doing the same thing or persisting with the same venture? And I have seen a number over the years, particularly there's some larger corporates where they were loss-making. I remember a very large contracting company. They had 6 or 8 large projects over about 6 years that lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The companies almost went broke a few times, but they kept doing the same strategy. And I remember talking to them, I was a financier, and again, as a financier, there's a limit to how you can influence a company's strategy. It's the company's board and shareholders ultimately that are responsible. But there was always a bit of like, why do you keep doing the same thing again? That was always the underlying question. And I remember the chairman of the board, he said, no, we've asked ourselves the same question. So I think there's the thread of and this is psychology of management as well, like don't be too proud to say, my strategy is wrong. Like literally, my strategy, our strategy. And I think this goes a bit to what I was saying about the entrepreneurs, particularly the ones who are a little bit more paranoid about these things. They'll be constantly challenging themselves like, is this the right strategy? Should I keep pushing on? Whereas again, the corporate world, if there is a lot of money floating around an organisation, it's very easy to keep funding losses and sticking with plan A, even though plan A may not actually ever work. So I think the advice is probably to be far more critical around, will the strategy succeed? Will the project, and projects is a really good example. I know you're from a project world as well, is like, will the project be delivered on time and on budget? And if the answer is yes, well, let's challenge that 10 times and show us 10 times. And then the moment something deviates, like, well, we need to go back again to challenge, will the project be delivered on time, on budget? And I've seen a lot of denial over the years. To be honest, I've seen a little bit of cover-up of, the project was never going to be delivered on time, but the reporting was never escalated properly. So I think that's at a broader business level, is be hypercritical to yourself and the team. It's like, we really need to be confident that this is going to actually work or be delivered, or if it's a business that doesn't look like it's going well, to critically and objectively assess what needs to change. And it's not necessarily shut it down, but don't make changes too late. I think that's probably one of the lessons over the years, both for businesses and in projects, is not let things run away too long before making necessary changes.
If you were starting your business from scratch today, what would you do differently?
If we talk about the Notwithoutrisk Consulting business, which started in mid-2020, I'm not too sure I'd do anything differently today. I think as a small business owner, which ultimately is just 3 of us in the consulting business, you sort of have to be a bit of a jack of all trades. You have to be good at sales and marketing, obviously good at doing the consulting work. I think the technology side, I think the last couple of years with some of the advances in technology, not just AI, but just technology platforms, software applications, we've sort of really stared into the need to ourselves adopt a lot more sort of cutting edge technologies. And that sort of brought us to Shelf Labs a little bit, where we've set up a separate technology venture with 2 other co-founders. One's a young Indian tech entrepreneur, incredibly smart, and then the other one's a former CIO, Chief Information Officer, for a number of financial institutions. And we want to really think about getting these new technologies and putting them into applications for small to medium businesses, initially around risk and compliance, to sort of effectively help them better identify and manage risk and compliance with the use of, smart tools. If you're not comfortable with it, surround yourself with really smart people, and they're generally going to be younger, smart people these days when it comes to some of the new technologies. I think that's probably the thing I'd do different. I probably would have got a little bit quicker in getting technology embedded in the business.
And that actually ties up to my next question. For someone earlier in their journey, what advice would you give them?
There's a little bit of a fork in the road question for the startup founders. Surround yourself with some people that have been down this path a little bit. Don't feel you have to do it yourself. And the reality is, if you're 18, 19 or 20. The good thing is you are fearless, which is why you embark in this path. But the reality is you don't have business experience generally. So you need to access that and make sure you don't have preventable mistakes. It was also a bit of the catalyst for writing the Startup Toolkit book in 2024 was I wanted to sort of put down in print a bit of the lessons that I'd learnt and seen over the years with startups. I've got it all up here in my head and I should just put it on print and share it. So the toolkit itself is Startup 101. It's not a technology book. It's more about how do you take an idea, test it, whether or not it's something that could form the nucleus of a business, and then how do you go through the business planning, the financial side of getting a startup up and running, and then actually the third phase of the startup life cycle, as I wrote it, is up and running. And so it's a bit of like trying to help some of these younger founders that may just have an idea without necessarily a strong grounding in business, but just try and help guide early stage founders who may just have an idea and don't know how to actually start a business.
Do you notice differences between very young founders and founders that have gone through a career and are thinking of starting a business later in their life?
Look, I think some of the later career stage founders are definitely eyes wide open. I think they're a little bit more battle weary from their corporate careers. And I think there is a little bit of conservatism there, which is good. So they want to make sure that they hit the mark. And I think, they're just maybe a little bit more cautious and wanting to make sure that the chips they put down are ones that they'll get a return on. I think the younger founders got lots of energy, there's no doubt about it, much better technology skills. I've already touched on this. A lot of them, they're actually doing the building, whereas I think some of the older founders are possibly not doing the building of the tech parts of the business, more getting other founders or getting some other employees in to do the building. I think that's a clear difference. I think the aspirations are very similar. They all want to build great businesses. I think there's no difference there. I think in terms of dealing with business partners, taking risks, there's no doubt the younger ones are definitely fearless and they'll basically have a crack talking to anyone, trying to negotiate a deal, whatever the deal might be. I suspect some of the older founders are a little bit more deferential of the process. I don't think any one group's better or worse. I've seen a few where there's a mix of younger and older founders as well, and it's an interesting combination. One of the challenges, irrespective of the age of the founder, is probably, again, the reality that it is tough getting a startup off the ground. They definitely all don't succeed, and it can be a bit of a hard slog. And what I think is also this double-edged sword, I think I touched on before, that these new technologies and platforms, vibe coding, for example, it's actually really easy to start something up. And in many segments, whether it's B2B or B2C, there's a lot of competition. There may already be something out there. And even if yours is a better idea, it may not make money just because it's a very crowded market and the existing players in the market, be it startups or a bit more advanced, they're not necessarily making money either. Startups themselves are being disrupted by newer startups. So I think there's this need to sort of be really realistic about, do you have a real competitive advantage, and is there a market there that will pay and can establish a viable business? Every business is different, and all the founders have got a slightly different approach and psychology to this. And I think if you're looking at a larger regional or global market, even if you have got something which is similar to others, you can still gain just a little bit of market share and be successful. And I noticed from the last couple of trips to Japan, there's a lot of businesses around two areas. It's like voice AI, lots and lots of voice AI businesses, and also lots of all things social media platform businesses, whether it's AI-generated content or whether it's content management or whether it's platform distribution partnerships. There's a lot out there, but at the same time, it is a very large market. So you don't need too much success to actually be off and running.
And do you think starting a business later in life actually gave you an advantage?
Yeah, look, I think it definitely did. Probably more my financial background as much as anything else, because I'd spent so many decades looking at businesses and analysing financial forecasts and pulling apart assumptions between financial forecasts and quite complex financial models for some of the larger ventures, projects and companies, I've probably got a little bit of a head start on others when it comes to just picking up cash flow forecast or a profit and loss statement. Balance sheets are less important in startups, but I think that's probably a bit of my advantage. I like to think I've spent a lot of time looking at strategies, the good, the bad and the ugly. I've looked at thousands of financial forecasts, and I guess for sort of a fairly decent slab of the career was actually looking at risks as well. So I sort of bring this blend of strategic, financial and the risks aspect to it. That it does mean that I can sort of help organisations and bring a unique skill set. The art with the founders in assembling an advisory board is you want to have some really smart tech people. You want to have some really smart founders that have walked in those shoes before, and you need some hard-nosed business and financial people, which I'm sort of probably in that category a little bit of. I'm very diplomatic usually, but I just don't think that's going to work. or financially it doesn't stack up. If you can get a good advisory board with that skill set, and even boards more generally for established companies, that's sort of a little bit of what they're wanting to get, is the blend of skills and experience.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us today. Where can people find you?
Oh, well, it's pretty easy to find me after that LinkedIn story. Yeah, look, I'm on LinkedIn, and I think, as I said before, I genuinely will talk to people that contact me. For the risk, all of my stuff is on LinkedIn, so you'll be able to find the various links. 52 Risks is 52, the number, 52risks.com. Free resource, and there's a newsletter that comes out more or less once a month with just my thinking on risk management, plus blogs that get posted. For the Startup Toolkit, Gōru, and Gōru is Goru, GōruWorld.com, and Gōru is the Japanese word for goal, as in achieve your goal. Jump onto that website. It's got the book in print, ebook and audio format, and there's also a bundled toolkit of pitch decks, business plan, cash flow forecast and project plans. And again, we've got a newsletter there. It's actually a weekly newsletter, so you can get little tips and blog articles with our fantastic little ninja character there as well. So yeah, look, thanks Jacques. It's really good to do the session, and best wishes with the Late Start Advantage podcast.
Thank you very much.